So in the previous video I mentioned that you need to know when to stop and when you need to keep going when factoring. So just like in the other videos, we need to make sure we pay special attention to what kind of function we have. So here we can see that our highest degree is 2. So that means that this is a quadratic. So let's again write our standard form for a quadratic. Ax squared plus bx plus c. Let's put our terms underneath the appropriate heading here for the quadratic we're given. So this is 6n squared minus 24. I do not have a middle term. There is no non-squared term or an x term, so that's going to be a plus 0n. So now I have a quadratic written in standard form. So just like the previous ones, we always look for our greatest common factor, because sometimes once we get the greatest common factor, we're done. So the greatest common factor between 6 and negative 24 is 6. So that means I can divide a 6 out of every term, and that comes out in front. So that means here I have n squared plus 0n minus 4. But what is 0 times n? 0 times n makes that term go away. I'm going to show you a shortcut for this. But before I go on, I need to see if I can factor this. So what I'm going to show you is that both of these are perfect squares. So when I have a 0 term in the center, n squared is a perfect square, and 4 is a perfect square, and also I have this minus in front, I should be able to factor that. So let's go ahead and do our x. So negative 2, n squared minus times minus 4 is negative 4n squared. And our middle term is 0n. So I know that n times n gives me n squared. If I want my factors of negative 4, I know I could have 1 and negative 4, or I could have 2 and negative 2. When I add these two together, I end up getting 0. So that's the one I want. So I'm going to put 2 and negative 2. So remember, the whole purpose for doing this is to get those terms right there. I'm going to rewrite this over here. So this was 6n squared plus 0n minus 4. I don't want to get confused with this 6, so I'm going to bring this down and I'm going to write that right there. So what am I factoring? Just what's on the inside. So I'm factoring n squared plus 0n minus 4. This is what I'm switching out. So I bring down my n squared. I have a plus 2n, a minus 2n, and then I bring down this minus 4. So now I have 4 terms. I'm going to split them into 2 equal pieces. So for this first half, common factor is n. So n squared divided by n is n. 2n divided by n is 2. For this second part, I can factor out a negative 2, especially since my first term in this side is negative. I'm going to factor out a negative 2. So negative 2n divided by negative 2 gives me n. Negative 4 divided by negative 2 gives me positive 2. So if we notice, n plus 2 is the same number as n plus 2. That means I can factor that out, and that gives me n plus 2. And then I'm still left with n minus 2. So that's this number right here. So I don't want to forget the 6, So the full factored form is n plus 2 times n minus 2. So the moral of the story is, when I have 6n squared minus 24, if I factor out that 6, I have to realize that this here is a quadratic, and this here is what's called the difference of two squares. So what does that mean? That means that this is a perfect square and this is a perfect square. So the difference of squares is actually a very special kind of quadratic, and there's a shortcut. So if you notice here, let's just look here. So if I'm going to show you the shortcut. I'm going to write just this part. I'm going to pretend that 6 isn't there. So if I had n squared minus 4, and if you notice so far, I get two binomials when I factor. If I take the square root of n squared, I get n and n in the front. If I take the square root of 4, I get 2 and 2. So because this is a negative, one has to be a plus and one has to be a minus. So that there is the shortcut without having to go through all this. If you're not sure, go through the way we've always been doing it. The last thing I want to say is a word of caution. You can only do this shortcut with the difference of squares. I'm going to just bring that 6 down there so we can see it's the same sort of thing. Okay, so caution. If I had n squared plus 4, this is what's called prime, and I'm going to prove it to you. So remember, that would be the same as n squared plus 0n plus 4. So if I go ahead and work this out the way I have been, 4 times n squared is 4n squared, and my middle term is 0n. If I'm looking for my factors of n squared, that's n times n. And if I'm looking for my factors of 4, it's 1 times 4, 2 times 2, negative 2 times negative 2, negative 1 times negative 4. Nothing will add up to 0. So that means for this here is what's called prime. You can't factor it. So this negative in between the two perfect squares is critical. If that's not a negative, you cannot do the shortcut.